Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a timely and engaging discussion on U.S. foreign policy in an era of global upheaval. This event today is hosted by the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, in which we are a hub for policy, international affairs, security studies, and governance. We're situated right outside Washington, D.C., and the Schar School prepares the next generation of public leaders while engaging directly with today's most pressing challenges, some of those that we'll be talking about today. My name is Christina Bonfiglio, and I serve as the Director of Enrollment and Marketing here at the Schar School, and I will be today's moderator. I am thrilled to be joined by three outstanding scholars whose work helps us make sense of the world we're living in and what may come next. As global crises mount, geopolitical tension, climate insecurity, rising authoritarianism, forced migration, and fractured institutions, the landscape of U.S. foreign policy is shifting rapidly. Our faculty experts are here to explore today's most urgent foreign policy challenges and the implications for U.S. engagement abroad. Now, let me start by introducing them. First up, we have Dr. Philip Martin, who is an assistant professor of international security. He specializes in civil wars, political violence, and African politics. His award-winning research published in International Security, African Affairs, and more has been supported by MIT, the Guggenheim Foundation, Fulbright, and USAID. Professor Martin earned his PhD from MIT, a master's from Carleton University, and his bachelor's from the University of Guelph. Professor Martin has a recently published book, congratulations, entitled Strong Commanders, Weak States, How Rebel Governance Shapes Military Integration After Civil Wars. Welcome to the conversation, Professor Martin.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Professor Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera, and she is a professor and co-director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, TRACC for short, at the Schar School. A leading expert on U.S. Mexico relations, organized crime, and migration, she is also the author of Los Zetas, Inc. and co-author of Frontera, A Journey Across the U.S. Mexico Border. Professor Correa-Cabrera is a Fulbright U.S. scholar in Mexico and earned her PhD from the New School of Social Research. Be on the lookout for her forthcoming book, Coyotes LLC. Welcome, Professor Correa-Cabrera.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And finally, but certainly not least, with us today is Professor Meghan Garrity, who is an assistant professor of international security and law here at the Schar School. Her research focuses on political violence, mass migration, and international law. Her forthcoming book, Disorderly and Inhumane, explores mass expulsions of ethnic groups over the past century. Professor Garrity holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has over a decade of humanitarian experience in Africa and the Middle East. Welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you. Looking forward to our discussion.
So I know we have a lot to talk about, but I wanted to start us off with a big picture question for all of you. Given the interlocking global crises we're facing, from war and climate change to migration and democratic instability, what do you see as the most urgent challenge confronting U.S. foreign policy today, and why? I'll take a volunteer, whoever wants to go first.
And I can probably go first. I would like to say I was not born and raised in the country, but I am a dual citizen. And what I have been seeing, now in the United States, there are a lot of divisions. In order for the United States to be successful in its foreign policy and, and social development, economic development, it has to do with unity. Polarization fractures society and the capacity of the United States to be successful in foreign policy and in the global, in the global realm. So unity, understanding diversity, including inclusion of everybody. This is a country of immigrants as well. So unity and, the inclusion of everyone in the society would be a start point to become successful.
Yeah, I can follow on from that. And I really like Guadalupe's point about the need for domestic social and political cohesion. I think that is probably something that the political elite and the major political parties in this country undervalue as an important determinant of U.S. interests and foreign policy effectiveness in the world is actually having, a broad, foreign policy that is supported by a broad consensus and has buy-in from its own political citizenry. And so that's probably its own separate topic that we could talk about if we have time to circle back to. But getting to your question, Christina, like what are some of the big challenges out there? You could talk about some of the prominent ones that have been highlighted in the news right now, like nuclear proliferation. If Iran were to race to the bomb and acquire it, does that trigger nuclear proliferation and more nuclear racing from other states in the region? It's one of those topics that goes long stretches of time with nobody talking about it, and then all of a sudden when it's on the table, it's like, oh my gosh, this is like the most important threatening thing that could possibly happen. um, you know the changing multipolarity in the world, and the United States is going to have to manage the fact that it's no longer the international hegemon that can dominate the international system and, kind of create an international order to its liking without the buy-in and cooperation of other major powers in the system. There's a lot of people who have written about China's rise and the potential for instability that could go along with that. Historically, there's a pretty poor track record of very powerful states becoming less powerful and that happening in a peaceful way. And so, historically that can lead to problems. And so that's a big challenge that the US has to manage. But just the last one that I wanted to throw in here, that speaks to maybe some of my own research on, state fragility and human rights and conflict. For my money, the international challenge of our time that creates the most political violence and the most human rights abuse is the problem of badly ordered and governed states that don't provide good services for their own people, that aren't seen as legitimate, that aren't able to effectively solve local problems. And this can lead to everything from migration to human rights abuses to humanitarian catastrophes. We're seeing this, in places like Sudan right now. We're seeing it across the Middle East and Central America as well. Again, not a problem that dominates the headlines always, because it's sort of an ambient problem that's out there in many parts of the world. But I think it's a very serious issue that the United States will continue to have to confront going forward.
Thanks for that. And Meghan, over to you.
Great. Nice to virtually see everyone. And I would definitely like to echo Professor Correa-Cabrera and Martin's comments already, kind of jumping off on something Phil said. I'd just like to echo the question of the U.S. retreat in the world or U.S. isolationism when it comes to foreign policy. I think this is a huge question on whether this is just epiphenomenal with Trump or if we're going to see this continue moving forward. And then what comes in the absence of this quote unquote liberal international order? Do we see it moving forward? Do we have a new order? Kind of what comes next, specifically, I think as it relates to a lot of cases on the question of aggression. We have international law that says states should only territorial, aggrandize in the face of self-defense or if there's approval from the UN Security Council, yet we consistently see this norm being violated when it comes to either Russia and Ukraine, Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or even in the case that we're seeing when it comes to Israel in Iran, although they obviously framed it as quote unquote preventive self-defense. There's a whole body of research around whether or not that actually meets the definition of international law or not. And I think we're going to get more into this question of Iran later in our discussion here. So what happens if we don't follow these norms anymore? What does that mean for international order? Who will step in? Will anyone step in? I have some comments on middle powers, I think, moving forward. Countries like Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, what role do they play? I think that's something to really watch. So that I would think would be the main global quote unquote crisis. Where do we go from here when it comes to this commitment or alleged commitment to peace and security and human rights that came out of World War II with the creation of the United Nations? But the only other one I would like to add, and this isn't an area of my own personal research, but I think it's really important, and there's a lot of great political science research on this, is the question of disinformation. So deliberately false information that's intended to mislead or deceive. As we have these global crises, we no longer have a common set of facts. And of course, we had propaganda and misinformation and some disinformation before. But if the US public can't trust its institution and its leaders to give them information about what's happening, I think we really need to, as scholars, as informed publics, as students, work to figure out and build skills to be able to deduce fact from fiction and really combat this disinformation.
There's a lot of challenges there, and I know there's so many more that all of you work on in your research and that we do at the Schar School here. There's been a little bit of conversation already about the recent issues in Iran, and so let's just jump in before we move forward. Just this past weekend, the U.S. conducted military strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure in response to escalating enrichment activity and regional threats, marking a major escalation with wide-ranging implications. And so, for all of you panelists, I know it's kind of fresh here. What might be the potential global repercussions of the U.S. strikes for international security and diplomacy? And Meghan, I might punt this one over to you first, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I am not an expert on Iran nor the Middle East. There are a lot of excellent resources on this. A lot of really prominent scholars have written things in outlets like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. So I'd encourage people to go there to really hear from some leading experts on this. I mean, one thing I would say, following off of my last point, is what does this mean for international norms? So for example, Israel is saying that there's the threat of Iran developing the nuclear weapon, that they're weeks away, maybe a year. There was some confusion over that timeline, I think. And so that's why they needed to do the preventative strike. Although we've been hearing the same thing, there's many clips put together since 1996 from the same president, Benjamin Netanyahu, and U.S. intelligence said that we weren't close, although now we've heard from President Trump say, well, we shouldn't trust our intelligence. They actually were close, and that's why we were supporting them. So again, back to, we're not operating with the same set of facts about what's going on, even though we have an international body that's supposed to help us be able to adjudicate that when it comes to nuclear proliferation. I mean, what does this mean? Where do we go forward? I don't think we know yet. I think we have to kind of wait and see what's going to happen. Is this just going to be a tactical strike a la the assassination of Qasem Soleimani before, where Iran has small retaliation for U.S. military troops, which are certainly significant for those folks and for the region, but maybe allow this to be a small scale operation, or maybe it gets out of control and we see something more similar to Iraq. I don't think we know. We're hearing mixed things from Trump. One thing he campaigned on was isolationism, no wars, and now we see us joining Israel in this. So I think we have to wait and see.
I've got a few more questions about this particular topic, but Professor Correa-Cabrera, Professor Martin, anything to add there, or is Meghan's summary kind of, we got to wait and see and let this kind of unfold, kind of where we're at?
I would just want to say and reiterate the fact that, of course, we are in times of uncertainty and we are in times of polarization. That's why I insist that unity is very important. So we, as the people in this country, can really also put pressure on our government for them to, tell us what is the real information, the reality of the situation, and we need to have that, because these decisions cannot be just taken by a small elite. We can also mobilize together to achieve this information and to support or not these decisions that will have a major impact in the world. So as society, we also have a responsibility and we have the right to be informed and to support or not certain decisions that will have an impact all over the world.
Yeah, if I could, follow on to those great comments by both of my colleagues. One thing I've been thinking about is some of the ways in which this is actually very consistent with a pattern of U.S. foreign policy that goes back really to, the last 60, 70 years, which is this infatuation with the magical properties of coercive air power to achieve all sorts of positive political outcomes without a significant investment of cost or incurring, risks to U.S. troops. If you go back to the Gulf War, Vietnam, Kosovo in the 1990s, It's this same thinking that if you bomb the right people, if you send in U.S. air power, you can get regimes you don't like to do what you want without paying a big price for it. And Robert Pape, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago, he wrote a good book called Bombing to Win, in which he shows that that is just not the case historically, that it's very difficult to get what you want from a hostile regime through air power alone. Usually it requires much more than that. So this idea that if you drop big bombs on Iran, that they're going to give up their weapons or the population is going to rise up and topple the regime, I think is much closer to magical thinking than it is to a realistic assessment of what is likely.
Well, thinking maybe about the price you pay in a completely different lens, but about the same topic, in the news today is a lot of chatter about the impact on energy markets and economic stability, especially with the Strait of Hormuz, as it relates to our current situation in the Middle East. Any kind of comments on how previous, I guess, entanglements that we've been in as a society has impacted these markets, and maybe what we could be expecting to see, or where people should be looking to kind of get going back to the right information, or what you can, kind of expect based on previous history as it relates to energy, oil and gas, economic stability? I filled up at the tank this morning because I was a little panic buying, so I don't know about everybody else.
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly a lot of highly paid economic analysts are going to be scrambling to write reports about that in the coming days and weeks. If you look at U.S. interests from a sort of crude strategic geopolitical configuration, you would say, what does the U.S. want here? The U.S. wants to not have a hostile sub-regional hegemon in the Middle East that could control all of these trading routes and control access to cheap energy coming out of the Middle East. And so partly for that reason, as well as other historical and ideological reasons, the US and Iran have always sort of been at loggerheads, because the US doesn't want Iran to be able to achieve that sort of regional hegemony. And that is part of the reason that the US supports Israel in the way that it does, because Israel provides a convenient military ally to secure US interests in the region, among other, reasons that we could talk about if we wanted to. And so all that is to say that, this will be something that, US strategic thinkers are paying close attention to, and they will probably be looking at disabling Iran's capacities to disrupt oil trade in those areas, or disrupt the export of oil from other Gulf states. Um, you know, Historically, I think we have seen price fluctuations when you have this sort of instability and warfare threatening a key strategic area of the world like this. But beyond that, like what is likely to happen, your guess is as good as mine, I suppose. But I think it's useful to sort of keep that big picture in mind.
That is helpful. Well, I'm going to shift us away a little bit from Iran, and go into a little bit more of the research areas that my faculty colleagues on the call today focus on. And I might start with Professor Correa-Cabrera. In your research and in your new role this past year as co-director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, I know you do a lot of work on U.S. Mexico relations, organized crime, and migration, and that has also been a hot topic in the news now, but not just a now issue. So transnational crime, it's shaping both migration and border enforcement. And how could the U.S. recalibrate its southern approach without defaulting to militarized tactics?
Well, the response has different dimensions. And the problem is that militarization has been the way to go, and the focus has been on the U.S. Mexico border, and the same strategies to go after the so-called drug cartels. And the approach to the fentanyl crisis is just we have to go and arrest the the drug lords, the kingpin strategy. This has been a failed war on drugs. This has been a failed approach to immigration. It has been a failed approach to border security, and we have seen that. More drugs than ever come to the United States from different parts of the world, of course, through Mexico and maybe also through Canada. So what are we doing wrongly? We're not, you're approaching is through with a comprehensive, strategy. We have to understand that this is a multifactorial. We have multiple factors explaining the problems that have to do with immigration, border security, drug trafficking, transnational organized crime. We have to look at the root causes of the problems. Sometimes these root causes are connected. These are connected to poverty, to inequalities, violence, war. This has to do with the refugee crisis or the immigration crisis, right? But at the same time, there is a demand for jobs. Unskilled labor is needed in this country. Comprehensive immigration reform is a way to go. Of course, development countries in the global south need to be also responsible for their own people. There needs to be a pressure in that sense. But focusing on the border and militarization has not worked. What happens with drug consumption in the United States? It must be dealt with by looking at what are the health issues as a public health matter. So we have to deal with issues of poverty and inequality that cause people to form part of these so-called drug cartels, approaching this from just the supply of drugs. But what about the demand for drugs? This has to be done with strategies to deal with a public health crisis in the United States. So the United States and the global south need to collaborate. And there needs to be also not just to focus on the border and enforcement, but also prevention. Prevention from like when we have to do when we talk about drug consumption. But this is an overall matter that cannot be just focused on what happens on the global south. How drugs are distributed in the United States, how you protect your customs, how arms go to the south that empower these transnational these criminal organizations. The two parties, the United States and its global partners and neighbors, need to take this very seriously. We have to have comprehensive solutions for so complex issues. We're talking about drugs, security, of course, terrorism, like risk in terms of terrorism, but these things are separated. We cannot just combine all these problems into one imaginary enemy, such as immigrants. Immigrants are not the terrorists, are not / drug trafficking organization or connected to drug trafficking organizations. We need to separate this, and we need to approach the demand and supply for drugs. Risks are very complex, and we need to understand that complexity.
Thank you. And you mentioned global partners, and so I might want to switch over to Professor Garrity for a second. In your kind of opening comments, you mentioned the UN Security Council, and so I will have a follow-up question for you, but for those that are attending today who maybe are less familiar with the UN Security Council, can you explain kind of what that is and what the role of the UN Security Council typically is in global politics?
Sure. And we have whole classes on international politics where we have sessions allocated to this. But in short, it's an institution that came out of the creation of the UN with the UN Charter and after World War II. I would say its effectiveness and design has evolved certainly over time. So it's a 15-member body. The key thing to know is there's 5 permanent members, and they have extraordinary powers because they can veto things that they don't like. So anytime there's a resolution that's put forward by the Security Council, these 5 members, U.S., Russia, China, France, or UK, and U.S., help me out, guys. U.S., France, Russia, China, who am I missing?
UK and France.
Okay,
yeah, you got
okay,
them. You got them.
So anyways, they can veto, and we've seen that veto used consistently over time. So everyone has their pet crisis. So the U.S. Is obviously very closely aligned with Israel, and so anything that's come out after October 7th that hasn't specifically been in line with the U.S. and Israel's position, the U.S. will veto that resolution. Russia has done the same when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Russia did the same when it came to the conflict in Syria. China sometimes joins Russia as they did in Syria, or China in the case of the situation with the Uyghurs. And so these are really intense international problems. We need an international solution to be able to solve them. And so if the resolutions get vetoed, that makes it really difficult for the UN to be able to move forward. And we've seen in the last few years a significant increase in the veto being used by the Security Council, which is extremely problematic.
So what happens when the veto occurs? What can be done then to block maybe an undesirable action from that?
Sure. So there's things that can be done in the UN, and then there's things that can be done outside the UN. So in terms of the Security Council, if there's a veto, they can try to rewrite it or put something else forward. But in reality, most of the time, things don't move forward if they're going to be vetoed. The General Assembly, which is the body of the entire United Nations, can put forward resolutions themselves. So individual countries, everybody gets a vote, kind of like the U.S. House of Representatives. But those are not legally binding. So they're useful in terms of public opinion and raising awareness, but they don't have the same heft that the UN Security Council resolutions do, which are legally binding. So then you can move outside the UN. So civil society, very much towards what Professor Correa-Cabrera was talking about. I mean, individuals, civil society can come forward, can organize social movements, protests like we saw around the Arab Spring or Black Lives Matter, or to go historically, the anti-apartheid campaign around the world against the regime in South Africa that eventually brought that regime down with Nelson Mandela and others. So that's one way to kind of get around it, but it's a huge issue, and it's causing a lot of problems to solving these complex challenges within international politics.
Thank you. And so another complex challenge, I think, is a pretty dramatic shift in U.S. foreign aid. And so over to Professor Phil Martin. Can you help us unpack what shifts in U.S. foreign aid, particularly in Africa? What does that mean for us? Why is that important, and what might that do in terms of strategic competition, particularly with China and Russia in the region and globally?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and typically when I start my classes on African politics, I like to just sort of remind people of a few basic facts that most people seem to be unaware of, and I think are useful for sort of setting a baseline for this conversation. So, if we're thinking about the continent of Africa, which is probably the continent most affected by the dismantlement of U.S. aid, although certainly not only Africa. This is a continent that is growing fast, that has the world's fastest growing population. It has the fastest growing economy in the world. By 2050, demographers estimate that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all human beings on the planet Earth will be in Africa, and a very large portion of the world's economy will be in Africa. And so the United States, if it's thinking long-term strategically about what would be good for its interests in the world, it should probably be thinking about cultivating positive relationships and working, partnerships with governments and societies and businesses and civil society groups across the African continent, especially in very large, powerful places like Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa. And so, when you think about that, and then you look at the dismantlement of the U.S. foreign aid regime, it does raise a couple of thorny issues or questions. So I would say on the one hand, if we're looking at short-term effects, like what did the rapid demolition of USAID mean for outcomes in Africa in the short run? Well, in the short run, clearly there was a lot of bad that resulted from this, especially if you look at countries like Ethiopia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which were very reliant on U.S. donor assistance for things like humanitarian relief supplies, for food aid, for other critical forms of assistance. A lot of the projections are that there will be likely to be an increase in food shortages and decreases in support and relief for some of the worst humanitarian crises that are happening there. So from a short run perspective, that seems like a little bit of shooting yourself in the foot if you are thinking about cultivating a positive image for the United States on the continent. More long term, though, I think there is a bit of a more complex picture here, and I wouldn't say that it's just as simple a story as less aid equals worse outcomes for the United States or worse outcomes in Africa. There's a more complex relationship here between aid and long-term governance and economic growth. A lot of economists have questioned whether countries that receive large quantities of foreign aid perhaps wind up with certain types of institutional problems that make it harder for them to break free of that aid and become their own sort of autonomous sources of economic growth. This is a debate that's going on in the political economy, conversation in Africa for a long time. But when USAID was dismantled, there was a conversation that, hey, maybe this is an opportunity for African governments and societies to take on greater responsibility for some of these governance and economic tasks and become less dependent on and more autonomous from Western aid donors that have typically had a lot of influence there. So the last thing I'd say about strategic competition with Russia and China, I think the effects here of USAID closing down can be a little bit overblown in terms of, well, now you're ceding all the ground to Russia and China. Russia and China are not aid providers. They are not set up to do what USAID did, right? China is a bank basically that will bankroll infrastructure projects for African governments, and Russia is an arms dealer that will protect your president and sell you guns. Neither of them are really in the business of the type of development and food aid assistance that the United States was involved in. And so some of that conversation about the strategic implications geopolitically, I think miss some of that context sometimes.
That's really helpful context. I want to kind of go to the humanitarian aspects that we were talking about and maybe dig in a little bit more about humanitarian consequences of U.S. foreign policy. And so as we think about border policy for asylum seekers and migrants, as we think about mass expulsions, as we think about some of the changes that we've made in this new administration this past year, what's the impact and what are the humanitarian consequences that we're seeing now or that may have a more short to medium impact in the next couple of years? And I pose this to everyone because I feel like within each of your research areas, there's large impact here. But Professor Correa-Cabrera, maybe I can start with you.
Absolutely. I'm quite concerned about what is happening today. The United States closed its border and the possibility to apply for asylum to a number of people that found in the United States and contributed to the United States economy and society in very important ways. In the current, the current atmosphere and with the current policies, a number of people are returning to their places of origin. The mass deportations and mass detentions have huge humanitarian negative consequences for people. And in the context of insecurity and the power that transnational organized, crime or criminal organizations, for example, in Mexico and other parts of the continent. I'm talking about the Americas because this is my region of expertise. And we know that there are gangs and cartels and criminal groups, paramilitary groups in different parts of our hemisphere. If you return, if you deport people without making any a commitment with the governments and collaborating in this is going to be terrible. I guess the United States should open again for a comprehensive immigration reform that would fix the broken immigration system, the broken refugee system, and organize better the capacity to process asylum requests. That's very important. And as I said, the collaboration with the Global South is very relevant in terms of development, in terms of security, law enforcement. This needs to be, again, comprehensive. But with the current problems that we're going to have, we expect more refugees coming into, trying to go to the United States. They're probably going to hire smugglers in order to achieve, or in order to get to a safer place. So yes, I'm very concerned, and we have to have the countries of the global north and the global south more conversations and collaborations in this regard. In times of war, in times of military conflict, in times of more inequalities, we need to have more communication and collaborate, and not just like isolationism in the United States will cause more problems, both for the United States and also for other parts of the world. Because if these criminal groups, receive, deportations might help them to, might help these groups to have more people in their ranks. We need to be very careful in these times.
Professor Garrity, Professor Martin, any other comments from your perspective?
Could you just repeat the question again, Christine? You said about humanitarian consequences. Could you just elaborate?
Yeah, of any recent changes in U.S. foreign policy. I think Professor Martin kind of alluded to and talked through some of them in the continent of Africa, but anything else that we're maybe missing on this topic before I go to our panel or go to our guests and see if we have any questions from them.
I think the only thing I would add, building off what Professor Martin said, is many of the people on the call will probably be familiar with the DOGE cuts earlier this year, specific to the aid industry, with the dismantling of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which has now moved under the State Department, but in a very skeletal way. Cuts to other organizations like the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which did a lot for refugee populations, which funded a UN agency called the UN Agency for Refugees, which does refugee programs around the world. So there were a lot of cuts there, and there's been a lot of different coverage around that, affecting a lot of folks who are working in these industries, and most importantly, obviously, the people who are the recipients of this aid. But something Professor Martin, I think, said is important to be emphasized is most of the people who worked in this industry thought it needed to be reformed, that there were a lot of ways it could be improved. They agreed in some ways with the spirit of, we need more efficiency. There's ways that these programs could be streamlined. There could be more collaboration with government. We could reallocate funds to a different way. But the speed with which it was done and the lack of any kind of planning or organization is the part that is highly problematic. And so you see things like food assistance to places like Afghanistan and Yemen, which the U.S. was the main one doing, just no longer happening anymore. And that's just not something the U.S. has done. Even North Korea, we disagree, but we have food assistance there. So, some of these programs being cut have huge implications around the world, certainly from a moral perspective. But even if you don't care about humanitarian aid because it's the right thing to do, or you believe in human rights, there are strategic consequences for destabilization and governance outcomes, as Professor Martin said. So I think people agree that there can be improvements to the current government delivery when it comes to humanitarian response, but the current way that it's been implemented is highly problematic.
Thank you all. So I want to turn to those who are joining us today to see if we have any questions from the group that our panelists can answer. Please feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I can't promise that we'll get to everyone, but we'll do the best we can. So if you want to drop them in the chat, I'll read them out loud and we'll go from there. And in the meantime, it's a water break for our panelists. And maybe while I wait for our first question or two to come in, I have a rapid fire question maybe to tackle. If you have a super short couple word answer, what's one policy intervention, to our panel, big or small, that gives you hope right now? I know we've kind of been on the, okay, wait, what's going to happen? And we're kind of on the doom and gloom a little bit, but what's something out there that maybe gives us some hope?
I mean, I'm happy to start. This is kind of a punt. Well, I was thinking about your question. And I think one thing that gives me hope as a faculty member are the students. So we come into class. I taught intro to international politics last semester, and it's a lot of the things we've been discussing. There's paralysis on the Security Council. That's totally ineffective. We have these Geneva Conventions, and no one is adhering to them anymore, and civilians are being targeted more than ever before. Countries are invading other countries they're not supposed to do according to the UN Charter. And so there's a lot of what maybe understood as negative information, pessimistic information, yet the students come to class. So many people are interested in these topics. They ask great questions. They want to pursue additional courses, additional education in this. And I think the only way we're going to get out of these problems is if new people get involved with new ideas, with new energy. I mean, some of us who've been working in this for a while, it can get a little bit overwhelming. You can get a little bit down. And so the energy and enthusiasm of the students to continue to work on these things, I mean, these are long-term efforts. Some of these problems will not be resolved in our lifetimes, but I think the hope and optimism of the new generation is really inspiring to me from a practical perspective, less on the specific policy side.
Well, and that's big words of praise for our students coming from our teaching award winner this year. So congratulations again to Professor Garrity on winning that. That says a lot about you and your students.
I mean, I'll throw out, a general comment here, which, I think we're all in our own like domains and policy areas concerned about many of these issues and concerned about whether, current U.S. Policymaking and decision making is likely to yield, positive outcomes for a lot of these things that we care about. I think if you step back and ask, does a period or does this sort of period of challenge to the older liberal internationalist order, by which I just mean, a system in which the United States and other Western countries sort of set a broad set of rules about political and economic behavior in the international system, and expected other countries to sort of, fall in line with that and use military force where necessary to sort of get their way. Moving towards a world where that's less, the taken for granted set of assumptions, and that there's a possibility of a different type of international order. I don't think that that's all bad, and I think that there were some issues with the prior, liberal internationalist order, which was not always liberal and not always well ordered, that probably did require addressing and did require serious reform and intervention. And that's not to say that we are likely to arrive at some place that's actually better. But it is to say that, there are real challenges of international cooperation and global governance that were not necessarily being solved perfectly by the previous system. And so if there's a possibility of a reconfiguration, and, I'll just use one small example here. When the U.S. cut its foreign aid to Africa, a lot of African governments started saying, well, maybe this, is a sort of a signal that we need to think seriously about banding together and maybe, creating more political unity, giving more power to the African Union, and sort of, having Africa speak with a more unified voice on the international stage in the emerging world order that we have. And so, that's just one small example of a potential unanticipated repercussion, but we don't really know where this is all going to go in 5, 10 years time.
And Professor Correa-Cabrera, anything from you before I get over to our questions in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, what gives me really, really, really easy, what gives me hope? I think that the role of the civil society, when we talk about when we talk about politics, we just not only talk about the state. We don't not talk about like the role of the government or the society has a lot to say, not just not that we just should not only focus on the state. So what gives me hope is the possibility that we have to manifest ourselves. Social mobilization is so important. We saw that in Los Angeles, and I mean, we saw that after, in the No Kings protests, and there's going to be a midterm election, and this is going to be, a push towards, pressuring the government, other people that represent us to do their jobs. So Congress needs to also do something. We know we are a democracy. So my main hope relies on the people.
All right. Well, a couple things for us to be hopeful about here. And I know I work with our prospective students that are joining our undergrad, grad, and PhD programs here, and I hear a lot of what you were all saying in essays about why you want to get into public service or public policy or political science. And so it does bring me hope that there's some good things ahead. So over to our chat. I have a question from Pavan. I hope I got your name correctly. That says, I heard the long-term bad effects of USAID. Is there similar issues with World Bank loans? I wonder if those are vicious cycles for the developing world. Do they both have the same effects? And I'm reading it kind of word for word, so I don't know.
Sure. Well, I can take a swing at this. So the question, as I understand it, are there also, negative implications of the way the international financial system and the international banking system works with the World Bank, which is, this institution in which the United States has long had a sort of controlling interest, and other, European countries are the major funders. And the World Bank, it does a lot of work in the developing world. It does a lot of work in Africa. It provides direct financial assistance to governments, as well as a variety of other development programs and more sort of direct local level assistance to citizens in a variety of ways. Now, the World Bank, for as long as it's existed, has come under criticism. And some people have made this type of criticism that if you offer these loans and offer this development aid to, poor countries in Africa, that comes with strings attached that reduces the choices that citizens and governments have about how they would like to govern their societies and the policies that they would like. So just as an example, in the 1990s, people talked about structural adjustment, and in order to get loans from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, African governments had to cut a lot of public funding, and this led to austerity politics and, potentially contributed to, economic hardship in the time that had consequences for economic instability. So people have, thought about this, I think, as part of the larger problem or the larger question of donor-recipient relations in the world, and whether an international economic system in which rich countries give loans with strings attached to developing countries is a system that ought to be rethought. And there are many citizens who would like to see that happen. But of course, it's a complex question, because the World Bank does a lot of things, and I think some of the things it does are probably pretty positive on net, and some things perhaps less so. So it would need to be evaluated, I think, in a more fine-tuned manner, than just saying that, it has a single consequence or effect in the world.
Just to add to that, of course, conditionality of those loans, and that we saw that a lot. I'm from Mexico. The conditionality of the International Monetary Fund, of the World Bank. There are many books that have been written about the effects, like, of these asymmetries, but we have more information. There are many good things about international aid, and the global north helps the global south, subject to also some aims to achieve more geopolitical power. We're in a multipolar world today, and there is much more information. And I think there are more tools for the governments of the global south to kind of also inform about how this conditionality works and how it is working actually in um, you know, being a multipolar world today, being in a multipolar world today, give us a lot more capacity to the countries of the global south to respond and to just inform what is happening. And yeah, definitely, I agree with Dr. Martin about the good things that USAID, or I mean this international help aid, has done to the world. And I'm positive, and also I have hope that this I mean the more information that we have will put things in a better order.
Well, speaking of information, the next question in the chat, I think is a really interesting one, and maybe one that we don't talk about a lot in these types of panels, and one I'm really glad, especially with you all here specifically today. We have an individual, Rashmika, has asked, do you have advice or resources on being more properly informed on international politics? Sometimes I get overwhelmed, me too, with the abundance of information, and I wanted to know what resources you would recommend for a clear, more trustworthy overview of current events. And I'm going to ad lib here because I know we've talked about how a lot of these issues are complex and they're multifaceted. And so sometimes in looking at a channel, you kind of get one view on it, or looking at it from a really, really nuanced perspective and maybe not seeing the bigger picture. So how could our high school students, or anybody listening in the call today, or the general public, unpack what's going on out here? What would be some recommendations of resources to point them to kind of get information and start developing their own kind of opinions and opinions without being maybe biased from a singular lens in the media?
Well, it's a great question, and I feel like I ought to have a better answer for this because it's something that comes up a lot actually in my own classes as well. I teach a intro to comparative politics class where I ask my students to take some time every week to check in on current affairs, read the news, see what's going on in the world, read a story about a country you don't know very much about, and just learn something, right? And it might be one news story, once a week, and that, might not seem like a lot, but over time, you'll develop a sort of more complete picture of what is going on. Now, the question of, how do you fill out a rounded and informed perspective that's not, just totally subject to biases? Here it really is important to develop a critical perspective on who is producing the information that you are reading or watching or listening to, and what potential interest does that organization or person have in selling a particular point of view, right? Whether that's a media organization that is operating, maybe because it wants to maintain its readership or draw attention to particular stories that will gain, more attention, or it's, something on social media, which we know is designed to sort of attract things that have, the most conflict and sort of outrage surrounding them, rather than the things that are maybe objectively the most important, right? But maybe are less controversial. So you always want to have a radar for, you know, for what is the perspective and the interests of the source that you are, listening to. And that's not to say that you can find some perfectly neutral source of information somewhere, like, the international section of the New York Times is not some holy grail of unbiased, objective information. I mean, it's pretty good. It'll include a lot of information, and same with other major, media news outlets. But I think you do need to be deliberate about seeking out perspectives on things that are maybe a little bit different from your own. Or, hey, I don't understand, why people are, have this perspective on Ukraine or Russia or Taiwan or the Middle East, right? And it's different from what I'm hearing in my own social circles. Maybe I'll go and find some, voices that seem to be, operating in good faith and in a reasonable way, and try to read some perspectives that I don't necessarily, agree with, but maybe I could at least better understand what is the opposing perspective and point of view here, right? So that might be in an op-ed, or an essay, that you'd find on a place like Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, or in, the op-ed pages of some of the major newspapers. I would stay away from social media as generally places of, curating content and finding information, because again, everything's going to be at the end of that long filter that's subjecting news to this process of selection of just getting the most clickbait, outrage stoking pieces of information. And so you want to be very, very careful about relying on that to inform your picture of the world. But I don't know, my colleagues probably have more thoughtful things to say about this.
I really like what Professor Martin said. I would like to add a resource. Yeah, I mean, it's also important to be in the social media after you have developed the critical thinking that is needed. All mainstream media is important, and outlets like The Economist, Foreign Policy. But at the same time, I just have an additional resource because I was very recently part of a program for educators. The Council on Foreign Relations and the section of education have extremely interesting like resources, country by country, region, blogs. It will be a starting point because, it's a source that's very reliable. And of course, with all biases, I mean, where it comes from, where it's manufactured and from which perspective, right? It's not the same thing having the perspective of the United States, having the perspective from the Middle East or from China. We have to keep that in mind.
Can I just add two more quickly, Christina, if we have a sec? So I'll totally echo what my colleague said. The Council on Foreign Relations is a great resource. I actually use some of that in my own class, and I would agree with Professor Martin that you really need to look at the byline, like who has written this. Is it an op-ed where there's a specific opinion, or is it a news article, even though we know news articles have their own bias? But two plugs I would say that I listen to every day. One is the PBS News Hour. It comes in podcast edition, or you can read the stories online. I think they do a good job of sort of giving an overview of what happened that day. And the BBC World News does an update, a podcast, 30 minutes in the morning and then the evening, and then they have a longer one in the middle of the day to get a sense of what is going on, and then decide, if you want to read more about a certain story. Then you have all the classics that were mentioned: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, etc.
Fabulous. Okay, we've got about 90 seconds left. And so before I give the Schar School spiel wrap up, a super rapid fire question that just came in the chat, and it's going to bring us home today. What are the potential long-term consequences of U.S. isolationism, and how will it in fact affect triangular relationships between the U.S., China, and Russia, maybe the economy? 10 seconds to each of you. What do you think? What are we doing here?
I will say something very quick. In this world, isolationism does not work. We need to collaborate. We need to talk to each other. That we need to, there are priorities, but in the face of this world, we really, really need to talk and to work together.
Right. I would just say, yeah, in a world of, globally connected economies and technology that makes communication so easy and transportation can move citizens around the world, isolationism in a strict sense is just a little bit of an obsolete policy option, because there is no state that will be able to actually implement that and secure its interests. And the United States is a large nation state that has globally defined interests, and so it will need a globally defined foreign policy to secure those interests. The triangular relationship between Russia and China is interesting. We probably don't have time to dive into that, but we have plenty of faculty at the Schar School who will offer entire seminars on that subject.
All right, Dr. Garrity, bring us home.
I mean, I would just add again, it's a huge question. Like Professor Martin said, you can take classes on this. I think one thing I would just add is there's a lot of focus on U.S., China, Russia, and what U.S. policies, how they can impact that. I think we really need to focus on the middle powers. It's becoming a more multipolar world. Other countries are going to play a big role moving forward if you look at the next 10, 20, 30 years. Brazil, Russia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Argentina, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt. Those are the countries we need to spend more time focused on.
Well, I feel like we've got a great topic maybe for our next webinar. So thank you all for joining us today. And a particular thank you to Professors Martin, Correa-Cabrera, and Garrity for your insights. And for all of you listening, if you'd like more information about the scholarship and research of our faculty, please email schar@gmu.edu and we can point you in the right direction and make some connections there. And for those of you who are thinking about undergraduate programs here at George Mason or graduate programs at the Schar School, please be in touch. My team is well positioned to help you kind of navigate what the options are, and maybe you'll find yourself in class with one of my colleagues here at the helm. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Have a great day.